you're a violent criminal, you can expect bail, you can expect a light sentence and early release. Okay, so strict for the little guy and lax and uncommitted for the very serious stuff. Okay, this is a version of tyranny, but it's not straight up tyranny. It's not dictatorship. This is the favoring of some people and causes over other people and causes. And one of the things that characterizes Canada now and has done for a while is the uneven application of law.
Bruce Pardy, thank you for talking to me today, man. I am such a huge fan of yours. I read your work, I listen to you speak, and it is such an honor to have you here with me today.
Well, listen, thank you very much for having me on. It's a real pleasure to get to meet you, at least electronically.
Yeah, I told you this before we started recording, but I feel like you're the one person in this country who has a real clear understanding of what this is and where we need to go. Over the last 10 years specifically, but it's something that I've noticed for my whole lifetime, is that Canadians really don't understand what they are. Like we don't necessarily have a clearly defined identity, because I think a lot of our identity comes from, American media, of course, and American culture. However, Canadians have always prided themselves in being not American. Like if there's one way that I could define the Canadian identity as we see ourselves, it has always been, Canadians say, well, we're not American. Well, what does that mean? What does not American mean? Is that a good thing? Is it a bad thing? What is it? And you're the one guy that I feel like has a clear understanding of what Canada is. So I guess I want to open by asking you, like, what is Canada? And what is the state of the country today, in your view?
Right. I remember recently running into a quote from someone, don't remember who, somebody historical, who said, a Canadian is somebody who asks, what is a Canadian? I mean, this identity thing is chronic. And you're right that one of the prevailing features of Canadian identity is that we're not American. But we come by that honestly, because that is, in a sense, if you want to frame it this way, that is why the country exists. It came into being as a response and a resistance to the American Revolution. The British and the French wanted to maintain territory that the Americans didn't have. And so there is something in our cultural story that is based upon this idea, and it persists. And that's not to say that Canadians sort of relate it to that story, that the history, but it's there, and it has always been there, and it manifests as a sort of a knee-jerk anti-Americanism, even though in the present day we are dependent upon the Americans economically, militarily, culturally. We have a culture closer to the Americans than, of course, any other place on earth. We can go down there and blend in, and nobody knows that we're not American. We sound like them, we look like them, and yet we think we're not them. And, in some ways we're not. In some ways we're deficient, and especially in the realm of how we govern ourselves. So this is just one of the things I think that burdens the way the Canadians think about their own country and what it is that they want and what they think that they're supposed to be and how they govern themselves. And there are a whole lot of other problems too we can go into. But that's the start. That's sort of just a piece of this what I regard as a knee-jerk anti-Americanism that does us no good.
It is, and it's strange because, as I lived in the United States for quite a long time. And you're absolutely right. Unless you walk around advertising that you're Canadian, nobody would ever know.
No.
Right. And we have this weird relationship with the United States where we're always struggling to identify ourselves as something separate. But it seems like the harder we try to separate ourselves, the more like we become. And now we are at this critical juncture in this country where we have just experienced 10 years of a reckless, destructive ideology in the form of the Justin Trudeau Liberal government. Mm-hmm. And I at least feel that we are in this period of reckoning where we really are in a corner and we don't have much of a way out. And part of finding a pathway to something better means figuring out how to define ourselves. And I think that is really the main challenge that we face, is that we don't know how to define who we are, what we are, or why we're even here. And we also have this strange connection to Britain and the British monarchy that I think most Canadians don't even still quite understand. I've listened to you talk quite a bit about the Westminster parliamentary system. It's one that I abhor deeply. I hate it. I have a bitter hatred for that system. Myself personally, just because I feel that there are far too many avenues for corruption and authoritarianism baked into it. Mm-hmm. And I think the reason that those avenues are baked in is to give the monarch ultimate control and power. Bruce, what are the flaws in the system, the Westminster parliamentary system, that you can see, especially as they apply to Canada?
Right. Good question. And I agree with you that it has some big problems. Let's just back up one step briefly.
Okay.
You go back to the sort of the cultural story. We talked about the anti-Americanism as part of the origin of the country. Let's just recognize that the Americans have an origin story. And that story lies deep in the psyche of a lot of Americans. And that story is liberty. Because their revolution, their nation was created in the crucible of revolution to get out from under the thumb of the king. And origin stories can carry you a long way. Our origin story is almost the opposite. The Canadians are the ones that didn't want to rebel, that wanted to remain under the thumb of the king. Yeah. The Canadians were the ones who wanted to be subject to the authority of the king. In other words, the origin story of America, if you like, is liberty. The origin story of Canada is deference to authority. We want to be told what to do. And there's an element of that in the Westminster system. Now, we don't want to go too far with this, because if you compare the Westminster system to a whole lot of other ways that humans have been governed through the ages, I mean, the Westminster system comparatively is pretty good, because you at least have elections and you at least have representatives and you have at least the pretense of the rule of law. So it's not the worst thing the world's ever seen, but compared to the alternative, it is a very authority-oriented system. In the Westminster system, unlike the American, you have a small group of people that control the whole shebang. The prime minister and the cabinet and the Privy Council, for that matter, which is a bit of a black box for a lot of people. But the prime minister and the cabinet control both the legislature, the House of Commons, and the executive branch. The cabinet consists of all the ministers of all the ministries, and they direct the bureaucracy, and that's at least in theory. Now, that means that one of the ideas that's very, better expressed in the American Constitution, that is separation of powers, is pretty iffy in ours. I mean, we claim to have it, separation between the legislative branch and the executive branch, meaning that the executive, the bureaucracy, that which used to be the king, can't just go off and do whatever it wants. It has to have legislative authority from the people's representative. But in effect, that's not really true, because the same group of people control both branches. And so if the executive wants authority to go and do something, if they have a majority, they can go into the parliament and for that matter, a provincial legislature, and have that legislature enact a statute that gives them authority to do the thing they want to do. So I like to put this way. When people are thinking about how countries should be governed, how their country should be governed, how about the Constitution should have said or could say, there are two very different kinds of questions to ask. There's the what question and the who question. Now, the what question is the question everybody wants to talk about. Like, okay, so what should our rights be? What should the law say? What should the government be able to do? What is the result here? What should the decision be? Let's talk about the what, because we want to talk about the end results, because we don't like the end results. So let's change the end results. What should the end results be? Let's write those down. Okay, that's the what question. That it's not unimportant, but it's not what it appears to be. The who question is the more important question, because the who question is identifying who has the power to make those decisions. Who gets to control the what? Mm-hmm. So let me give you a concrete example. So in our charter, as everybody knows, we have rights listed. Freedom of expression, freedom of religion, freedom of association, and so on. Okay? That's the what. So people look at that and say, I have freedom of speech. Okay? Except you're ignoring the who. And the who is, no, the court is the who. They get to interpret the words of the charter and tell you what they mean. So the freedom of speech doesn't mean what you want it to mean. It means what they want it to mean. And if you want to fix that system, don't just try to rewrite the section. You have to change the who. Because even if you rewrite it, they will still have the power to interpret it afresh and decide, no, it still means what we want it to mean. Okay? So, and controlling the who is a much trickier problem than trying to describe what the what is supposed to be.
And I think that's the foundational difference between Canada and the United States, right? Like in their constitution, rights are bestowed upon the individual by God, whereas in Canada it appears, or in our Charter of Rights, rights are bestowed upon the individual by government, right?
Well, yes, but so let's just talk about that for a minute, because this is a thing that a lot of people are dwelling on, and it's I don't think it's quite the way that they think it is. So there are two realms here, and one is sort of a philosophical or even spiritual realm, and the other one is a strict legal realm. Mm-hmm. And philosophically, I'm very sympathetic to this argument that human beings have inherent rights given by God that governments are not able to take away. But now we get into a should proposition, and because that is the case, governments should protect those rights. Okay? But that should proposition is now a legal thing, because we've said, all right, as a matter of being human, you have these God-given rights. That's a philosophical position or a spiritual position. Fine, great. But the should is the legal system, the courts, the government should be recognizing those rights. Now, you're quite right. The American founding documents describe it this way, but it's still not just a spiritual or philosophical thing. It's a function of the court. So if you go into a courtroom, whether it's in the US or in Canada, and you say, Your Honor, I have God-given rights. They are the following things, and therefore, here's what you should do. Okay? Court's going to say, that's not the way it works. You have to show me the statute and the precedents. What did the courts before say about this? What does the statute say? Where are the lines drawn? What does the Constitution mean? What's the jurisprudence on what that phrase in that section means? This is all the law, right? So the law. So let's put it this way: there are two kinds of laws. There's God's law, and there's the law of the courts, and those two things are quite different. And you can't go into the courts simply pleading God's law, because They don't recognize God's law. They recognize the kind of law that is the basis of their jurisdiction.
Right.
It is, in fact, possible for a court to override your rights, your legal rights, if they can find a reason for doing so, like a charter right. We have Section 1. Section 1 says, reasonable limits. If I'm the judge and the government can show that there's a justification for overriding rights in this situation, then I, as the judge, have the jurisdiction now to say, well, it's going to be okay here. That is not obeying the proposition that you just described. And that happens in Canada, but it also happens in the US. Because the law of the courts and the law of God are different things. So I would prefer that not that people put away this belief, not at all, this conviction, but that they would recognize the difference between the two spheres and understand that in the legal sphere, you are dealing with power, the power of human beings to tell each other what to do. And referring to God-given rights in that sphere is not going to win the day.
Yeah, and you so eloquently explain it, and I was going to get to this, but we can talk about it now because you drafted a constitution for an independent Alberta, which I read last night, read again this morning. It's a beautiful document. It reminded me very much of the original Weimar Republic constitution. It's a very freedom-oriented document. But you outline in there the power that the judiciary has in interpreting individual rights, because you're absolutely correct, right? I mean, obviously you're a law professor, so you know this stuff.
Oh, don't take too much for granted.
But laws and rights are subject to interpretation by the judiciary.
Yes. And
it's dependent upon the judge that you have and their biases and their preconceived notions and what they believe. And it, when it comes down to this, it often gets muddy, right? Because again, everything is subject to interpretation. And,
yes.
When you're dealing with the legal system, you're hoping that you get a judge who is more, whose opinion or perspective more aligns with yours than, opposes, right?
Yes.
And so how do we get past that? How do we get around that in your view?
Right. No, it's a very, very good question. And so let me tell you about a memory I have of going to law school. My very first year, I had just entered law school. I was in the first term, just a few weeks in. I had a moment. I was sitting in one of my classes, trying to, like everybody else, trying to get my head around this thing that we were supposed to be mastering. And I remember thinking, I was listening to the prof at the front going on, and I remember thinking, you've got to be kidding. They don't really do it this way.
Yeah.
And what I meant was I was being confronted with the inherent uncertainty of the way the law worked. So you go into law school or you think about the law and you think, well, the law is a collection of rules. And so if I know what the law is, I know what the rules are, therefore I know what the answers are supposed to be. Okay? That is not the way it works. Everything is subject to interpretation and argument, like everything. So constitutions have an Achilles heel that you cannot get around, which is that they are written in words. And words contain ambiguities. And the ambiguities are resolved with the power of the person who's empowered to interpret them. So if you are in front of a court, the court has the power to tell you what the words mean. Now you'll read you read a provision and you think, well, that's clear as a bell. It's got to mean this. And sometimes it does. But sometimes you take a clear provision and the court, lo and behold, will say, well, in this case, not so much. So I don't mean to suggest that clear and precise drafting isn't important. It is, and it can help a great deal in narrowing the ambiguities that the court will find and will arise. On the other hand, it's not a panacea. You cannot hold back the power of the court simply by thinking that you are being so precise as to prevent the court from applying the meaning that it thinks that the provision requires in a particular circumstance. Okay, so one of the things I wish people could embrace is the inherent uncertainty of their legal system. And that's a scary thing, because that means that you are subject to the potential for the arbitrary whims of powerful people. And that is one of its problems. But if we accepted that, then we could go forward and try and fix it to the extent that it's possible to do. But right now, we are still focused on the what. Like, let's just list more rights, because I know a circumstance where somebody was imposed upon and we didn't have a right that suggested that they couldn't. So let's just list a whole lot more rights and try and cover everything. That won't work.
Yeah. And you know, as you're speaking, I'm thinking to myself, you know, just the idea of a judiciary unto itself is kind of anathema to the idea of individual rights and freedoms, because you have this judicial body that has the ability to impose its will on those rights and freedoms, right?
Yes.
I mean, these are deep philosophical questions that I'm not Bruce Pardy, so I end up running around in circles in my mind trying to figure them out, because obviously we need some form of judicial body to, you know, to enforce laws and regulate, you know, what we can and cannot do within our societies. However, once you introduce that body, you're now restricting the freedom of the individual.
Yes. So let's put this another way. We really have two bad choices.
Yeah.
Right? One is to be ruled by elites, and the other is to be ruled by the mob. And neither one is good. And what I mean by the elite and the mob is this. So, you know, in England, we were once ruled by the king. And the king was an elite. He was the ultimate elite. His word was the law. And there was a long, long process of trying to take power away from the king and give it to other places. And one of those places was the legislature. Now, the legislature, if you like, is the mob, because the legislature is elected. So in theory, and it doesn't always work out this way, but in theory, the legislature does what the people want it to do. You know, and power to the people. You know, that's great, except that it's not always great, because the people are a mob. So we have this legislature now, and the legislature also acts as a tyrant.
Yes.
And so what do? Well, what the Americans first do is create a Bill of Rights. Right? So the mob, you know, the Congress, okay, but there are some places that the Congress can't go, so we're going to have a Bill of Rights. So free speech and the right to bear arms and so on. So you're drawing lines. Okay? So what are you doing? All right, now you're taking power from the mob and giving it to an elite, because the courts are the elite to interpret the meaning of the section, right? So from elite to mob to elite. In other words, we're just going back and forth between ruled by elite and ruled by the mob, or a combination thereof. And those two choices are bad because they're not the right third choice, which is you want to be ruled by yourself.
Yes.
Right. Problem is that if we give everybody the ability to rule themselves in an absolute way, then you get violence. Because there's nobody backstopping you to prevent the other guy from imposing violence upon you. So here's the trick. How do you empower the state to keep the peace, to give it enough power for that, but not give it so much power as to enable the state to interfere and tell the people what to do? Right? It's got to be crafted so that you get the one but not the other. And that's not so easy.
Yeah, it's definitely tricky territory, right? Because, you know, finding balance there. I mean, there, just like within Canada's legal framework, like I feel like we are in a position now where our country has outgrown our legal system, our judicial system. And what I mean in that is, for example, I do regular conversations with Sam Cooper, who is an investigative journalist.
Yeah, great work.
Yeah, Canada's best, right?
Yep.
I mean, top tier in the world.
Yeah.
recently he and I have been talking about how the Stinchcombe and Jordan laws make it virtually impossible for the government to crack down on these organized crime networks that are distributing fentanyl across our country and into the United States.
Mm.
For people listening, just to give you a basic overview, the Stinchcombe law stipulates that the investigating body, whether it's the federal government or the provincial police, has to hand over all of their evidence to the defense prior to trial, so that the defense has the ability to create their defense. The Jordan law stipulates that the trial has to occur within a certain amount of time. Now, if you're tackling a case as large as, say, Chinese organized crime and all of their influences and all of their activities within Canada, you're going to need a longer period of time to work on that case, and that's why a lot of these cases get thrown out before they go to trial. And I feel like Canada is just woefully unprepared for the world that we now find ourselves in.
Mm-hmm.
Is that something that you see as well?
Yes. I might frame it differently. I'm not sure that it isn't worse than that.
Okay.
Because you are giving the government there the benefit of the doubt. You're giving them the benefit of good faith. You're giving them the benefit of things that have just gone awry. And I'm not sure that's quite so innocent as that. So I recently saw it described in these terms, and I think that's quite right. That we're now in a system where you have a combination of lax, potentially incompetent, obstructed enforcement and punishment of very serious things, combined with the strict moralistic enforcement of very little things. So ordinary people get speed cameras. So if you're like 7 kilometers over the limit in a 40 zone, you'll get a ticket, and you better damn well pay the ticket or they'll suspend your license. But if you're a gang or a drug den, or you're a foreign party interfering in Canadian elections, or any of the other, or for that matter, if you're a violent criminal, okay? If you're a violent criminal, you can expect bail, you can expect a light sentence, and early release. Okay? So strict for the little guy, and lax and uncommitted for the very serious stuff. Okay? This is a version of tyranny, but it's not straight up tyranny. It's not dictatorship. This is the favoring of some people and causes over other people and causes. And one of the things that characterizes Canada now, and has done for a while, is the uneven application of law. If you have a system where there are laws about all kinds of stuff that prohibit all kinds of actions, and those laws are only applied and enforced selectively, then you do not have the rule of law. You have the rule of discretion of the people with the power to decide on what occasion they want to choose to select from all those laws to punish you.
Right.
And that's where we're at right now, I think, in this country.
Yeah. And, you brought up a very good point, and something that I wanted to actually go into, because what we saw over the last 10 years was, a manipulation of our charter, a manipulation of the laws as they existed, interpreted through the lens of an ideology that our government at the time, and I still would argue our current government,
Sure,
ascribed to.
Yeah.
So again, we were subject to the interpretations of our Charter of Rights and our laws, but then you added on this extra layer of those rights and laws being pushed through an ideological lens.
Mm-hmm. Sure.
And what we ended up with was, damn close to tyranny. Like, we got very close. And I want to ask you, Bruce, as somebody who knows the law, this is your world, this is your career, you're an academic. What were those 10 years like for you? Like, were you watching everything develop and just thinking, oh my God, like, we are going to a very dark place?
Well, yes. So there's a bit of a paradox here. The short answer is yes, but on the other hand, it also wasn't all that surprising. So the phrase I like to use is shocking but not surprising, because it was consistent with the trend that we've seen over a long period of time. A long period of time. This has been in the works for a long, long time. It's come to a crescendo, if you like, for sure, or certainly did during COVID. But a lot of the things that sort of came to fruition during COVID were not sudden breaks. They were just more of the same to an extent that we haven't seen before. But nevertheless, still part of a curve. Mm. And this is one reason I think that people had some people experienced a great deal of shock during COVID, because the trend before was not apparent, and then suddenly it seemed like a brand new thing. Like, what is happening? But this is an extension of a logic, and let's just see if we can identify the logic. Okay, the logic is that government exists to solve social problems. Government is based upon expertise. Government knows best what it is that we should do. And if you combine that idea with the very Canadian idea of authority, then there's some explanation there for why it is that governments at all levels, I'm not just talking about the federal government, governments at all levels take it upon themselves to be involved more and more in just about everything, and to issue rules and regulations and guidelines and policies and bylaws and discretionary decision making, because that's what it thinks its job is. And I would guess an awful lot of Canadians would agree with them. If you went up to somebody on the sidewalk and said, do you think the government should be solving social problems? Mm-hmm. They might look at you and think, well, of course, that's what government is for. What are you talking about? Right. So as long as we are talking about policies, here's another, complaint that I have about how we talk about problems. People want to talk about policy mistakes, bad policy. The government has bad policy in this area. It should fix the policy. Okay. Well, there's no doubt there's a lot of bad policy, but it's not a policy problem. It's not a bad policy problem. It's a problem of the fact that there is policy about all of these things. The government shouldn't be making policy of any kind, good or bad. The government should leave us alone. But we're stuck in a Canadian way of thinking that it is the government's job to make policy about as many things as it can to try and fix all the problems on the ground out there. Now, forgetting that they never succeed in that. But nevertheless, that seems to be the belief in the mandate.
And you're hitting something that I felt strongly about for these last few months, because I was doing a bit of a retrospective on the last 10 years, but mostly the last 6 months, because this last election really felt like a very important one. And at the time I was swept up in the hype of it too. I felt like Canada had to make a decision. Do we want to do more of the same and keep sliding into the abyss? Or do we want to, I wouldn't call it, cause radical change, but bring in some form of change that might give us some fighting chance. But now in retrospect that I look at it, I'm like, really, Pierre Poilievre is just another part of the establishment. He's just the other side of the coin, right? And, would he have done much to rejuvenate Canada economically? Perhaps. Yeah, maybe we'd have some pipelines going, and maybe our trade relationship with the United States would be better. But it seems like in Canada and the United States as well, that we are very much trapped in an old way of thinking, and we don't really have a strong understanding of where the world is going. I think COVID, as you highlighted a few minutes ago, it shined a light on a lot of flaws, should we say, in our systems and in our societies. And The United States, I feel, had a little bit a better reaction to it, just because, as we talked about earlier, like they were born out of rebellion. So Americans naturally have a rebellious spirit. That spirit is very much alive there, you know. So in smaller rural communities or the outskirts of the urban centers, you saw a lot of more of that "fuck you" attitude. Whereas
Yes.
Canadians were a little more eager to be compliant, and the logic there was, well, if you just do what they tell you, they'll leave you alone.
Right.
And my argument was always, they shouldn't be bothering you in the first place.
Right.
Right? That's the root of the problem.
Right.
And so, Bruce, in the aftermath of all of this, now that it appears the dust around COVID is settling, at least from a superficial perspective, what are we left with here? Like, what is this?
Well, what you have is, so people say, you know, there's a lesson in the fact that the managerial state, as I like to call it, failed during COVID. Like the policies didn't work, the virus spread anyway. It failed. It failed. The policies didn't make sense. I'm sorry, my phone is dinging.
Oh, that's okay. Just let it ride. We'll just let it ride.
So the administrative state failed. Its policies didn't work. Right? That's not true. I agree that the policies didn't work. The policies were a complete failure.
Yeah.
But the managerial state itself succeeded beyond its wildest dreams.
Yeah.
Because it managed to seize control of the whole thing. Mm-hmm. You know, people behind a microphone on a Tuesday telling us all what the rule was going to be tomorrow. Like that is triumph. And what we're left with is still that monolith. We still have the idea that the managerial state is there to manage problems and all of us in the context of those problems. We did not do away with that idea. We did the reverse. We confirmed it. We extended it. And we're in a position now where the same kind of thing will happen again, maybe not exactly the same way, maybe not for a virus, but for some other purpose. The state has maintained and expanded the legitimacy of the idea that they are in charge because they know best, and you will do what they say. And there is no sign anywhere that I can see on the part of any political actor, any party in power or otherwise, of any political stripe in any jurisdiction, who have the position that no, we have to diminish, break down, dissolve the managerialism in our government and leave people to their own devices. I don't hear anybody saying that of the parties that are in these legislatures right now.
Yeah, I completely agree. And, you know, just to speak to that, you know, during COVID, we all saw videos of people being arrested for being at playgrounds or skating on a pond. And it seemed ridiculous to all of us. And the general interpretation that I saw was, well, they're being arrested because they're breaking a rule. And what I saw was that they're being arrested not because they're breaking a rule, but because they're challenging the authority of the managerial state.
And that's exactly why. And that's exactly why the truckers were treated as they were. It's not because it's not because they were actually a threat in any kind of concrete sense. They were threatening the legitimacy of the government's role in all of this. And moreover, it was a threat from the people themselves. This was the first time I can think of in Canada where regular people stood up and finally said, you know what? No, we're not doing this anymore. We don't believe in you anymore. We don't consent to this anymore. We don't trust you anymore. We don't want to do this anymore. That's a threat, not to the country, but to the government. That doesn't mean that the Emergencies Act was justified. It was clearly not justified, but it was an actual political threat to the standing government.
And I think they viewed it as a threat because of who those people were.
100%.
Right? Because these are blue collar, middle class people who are supposed to obey.
That's
the
correct.
authority of the managerial state.
Yep.
And that was the conflict we saw playing out in Ottawa. It wasn't that these people were breaking rules, they were breaking laws, or it was that these nobodies, these people who are supposed to be just faces in a crowd,
Yep.
taxpayer, pay your taxes, do your job, stay in the background, put themselves in the foreground.
Right.
And showed their authority, which I think was the main point of conflict.
Yes.
Right? Because you have this elite group who are in control of our country in Eastern Canada, and now they are forced to stand eye to eye with these blue collar nobodies, most of whom came from Western Canada.
Correct.
Which brings me to my next subject of conversation. Bruce, you are the guy that I believe has the right vision for an independent Alberta, should that ever come to be. You are the only person I've listened to that 100% understands the issues and has some very salient solutions.
Well, thank you very much. I appreciate that.
Oh, well, look, I'll just to be informal about it. I get tired of listening to these people talk about, independent Alberta, 51st state this, and then you ask a very simple question like, well, what currency are you going to use? And you just see the blankness in their eyes. Like they haven't even considered that we're going to need a currency. Right? You know what I mean?
Yeah,
but you're a guy that I listen to and I'm like, Bruce Pardy has his bases covered. This is something that you've put honest, real thought into, right? And you take a real philosophical approach to it to make sure that you're not impeding on the rights and freedoms of people. So, Bruce,
I should say that there are. I mean, I've been in contact with people who are, applying themselves to these questions. Now, it's not to say that we all agree necessarily on all the questions that are arising, but there is some work going on behind the scenes on these matters. You may or might not like the outcome.
Yeah, and you know what? I should clear that up because I listened to your conversation with Payman and Catherine Kowalczyk.
Right.
I agreed with a lot of what she's a brilliant woman. The only thing I didn't agree with was the imposition of Christianity in the way that she wanted it to be. And I'm a Christian. This is coming from a Christian person. I just feel like, for example, Canadian law, American law, Western law in general is very much based in Judeo-Christian law, right? And it works.
Yep.
Obviously, it's worked for a long time. But I feel that if you impose Christianity too much into the new system that you're trying to create, you're going to create natural friction with people who aren't necessarily of that faith. So you have to make it fairly ambiguous in that way, right? Mm-hmm. So, Bruce, I wanted to ask you because, as we detach ourselves from Justin Trudeau and we've attached ourselves to the Mark Carney ship and now we're drifting off into deep space, this independent Alberta conversation has become more and more prevalent. So how realistic is it for Alberta to become an independent nation? And have you put any thought into the 51st state idea? Is that a more rational idea, or should Alberta just face independence and go through the growing pains that come along with it?
Well, I think whether it ultimately becomes an independent country and remains one, or becomes a 51st state, I think the first step is the same either way, which is you have to resolve to leave, and you have to negotiate to leave, and then you have to leave, you become independent, and then if you want to join the Americans, then fine. And so my preference goes this way. If things went well and Alberta could find a way to make itself an actually free independent country with its own new constitution, then I would prefer that. Mm. However, if things go badly, and if it looks like what Alberta is going to do as an independent country is to reproduce what it is now, if it's going to reproduce the Canadian system or keep, the Westminster style government they have right now, it's going to keep the Alberta managerial state, which is what they have. If you're going to keep Aboriginal rights like they exist in Canada, if you're going to keep all those things, that exists in Canada and in Alberta, then you'd be better off as a 51st state, because now you're avoiding your own mistakes, and you will take on a status as a state, and you're better off as a state of the U.S. than a reproduced Canada. Okay, so this all depends. My preference all depends upon the path that is selected to go down.
And I think, Bruce, just really quickly to interject, I think that's the main challenge. The main challenge is putting it to people in a way where, listen, if we're just going to be another Canada, then there's no real point in doing this.
100%.
Because we're going to end up we're going to end in the same place.
There's no
right.
Just getting rid of Ottawa is maybe a small victory, but really it's not worth it. You're just going to you will have failed to purge the Canada that is inside Alberta right now. You have to, not only do you have to get rid of the Canada that is outside Alberta, you have to get rid of the Canada that is inside Alberta. And that is going to be the trickier thing, because inside Alberta, there are a whole lot of vested interests in the present system, just like there are outside Alberta. Mm. And this is going to be a challenge. It's going to be an internal political challenge for Albertans to try and establish a new way of doing things, a new way to govern themselves that does in fact uproot a lot of existing vested interests inside the province.
Yeah, and it's funny because I recognized the Canadian in myself when I was reading your document, because you're talking about a completely free society, getting rid of most if not all public programs. That means public schools, public health system, and even myself, the freedom warrior. I'm reading this and I'm like, public schools, Bruce, we can't get rid of those. And then I'm thinking to myself, you dummy, this is your conditioning, right? Because you're imagining a world without an education system,
right? Where
in fact we would just create a new system, a private system, where you would be able to choose which school your children attend, and help to develop their educational experience. So, you could decide whether your child goes to a technical school or a traditional school or a Christian academy, so on and so forth, right? So, in fact, you're expanding on the freedom of choice, right?
Yes.
Yeah. And so anyways, I was reading it last night, and you were making me see the Canadian in me, because I'm like, I'm so conditioned to these public programs. And I think that's really, at the heart of it, right? Is because we've been kind of in this socialist soup for 40 years. And it's going to take a lot to strip that out of us and really introduce freedom, because socialism in itself is a form of authoritarianism.
Yes.
Right. I mean, I read a statistic not too long ago that under Justin, I don't know if this is still true. I would imagine it is now, because I haven't heard anything about massive layoffs. But under Justin Trudeau, 1 in 7 Canadians were employees of the federal government.
Right. It is something big like that. It's horrendous. But if you add up the numbers at all levels, federal, provincial, municipal, local, school boards, and all of the other organs that are essentially extensions of the state. I mean, it is gobsmacking.
Yeah, and that's again another differentiating factor, I think, between Canadians and Americans, right? Because in Canada, if you get a job with the government, you're like, that's like viewed like socially as like top of the mountain. Like, oh, he works for the bureaucracy. He's got a pension, benefits. He's getting paid 3 times more than he actually deserves.
Right.
Whereas in the United States, it's like, if you build something on your own, that's what's lauded in that society, right?
Yes.
Like if you're an entrepreneur and you strike out and you build something and you make something happen and you're self-made is the American way.
Right.
Whereas in Canada, it's, bureaucracy made, I think, is more our motto, right?
We like to hide behind the state so that we don't have to fend for ourselves, to challenge ourselves, to provide all the things that we think we need. So my colleagues at Energy Probe have suggested that Canada from the very beginning has been a kind of grift, that various regions and provinces were induced to join Canada for the benefit of the subsidies and grants from the central government. I mean, you think of Newfoundland, for example, or Quebec for that matter. I mean, Quebec wasn't induced to join because it was an original, but today Quebec siphons off, a huge amount of equalization. And it's not just regions and provinces, it's industries and interested groups and all kinds of vested interests. One of my colleagues said, Canada is a cartel held together by bribes. Okay, this is not a country of a grand vision. This is a country of paying people off so that they'll behave. I mean, even the railway to British Columbia, to induce British Columbia to join, that's a kind of a bribe. If you join the country, we will build you a railway. Okay, don't just join because we have the right way to live. No, we want a railway, and that's in part the way the Canadian political brain works.
Yeah, it really is. Man, I've heard you say that before, but hearing you say it again, really just because, I'm thinking like with this Alberta, I'm originally from Vancouver. So I am from the heart of, the socialist wasteland. Right. I'm currently located in Calgary, moved here 3 years ago to escape BC. And, I am very much on the side of an independent Alberta, but, I'm asking all the questions that pisses everybody off. Like, what currency are we going to use? What is our government going to look like? Because I agree with you. You take Danielle Smith, for example. She's probably the most radical premier Alberta has had in a very long time, yet she's still part of the establishment. She still represents the managerial state. In a lot of ways, she is a federalist, right?
All things are true. Yeah.
Right. So we introduce a referendum. Now, Bruce, this was what I wanted to get to. So let's say we introduce a referendum. By some miracle of God, we vote yes to leave. Yeah. What are the steps after that? Because from what I understand, we have to actually go to the provinces, and then the provinces have to vote as to whether or not we can leave. Is that correct?
Well, not quite. So this process. So let's start with this. It's unusual for a country to have any indication about how this is supposed to work. Most countries don't have what we have, which is a Supreme Court of Canada decision saying, well, here are the steps. And we have that because of Quebec. In 1998, the Supreme Court decided a reference case about Quebec. And in that case, they said, if a province holds a referendum on a clear question to separate, and a clear majority supports it, then the province will have a mandate now to negotiate its departure. Not a unilateral right to leave, but a mandate to negotiate. And the rest of the country, federal government included, will have a mandate to negotiate similarly. They do not have any unilateral right to stop them. So, and at that point, the court says, then it becomes a political negotiation and not a legal one. So don't come running back to us. And so there's a lot of uncertainty in that. And people want to know, so what happens if? And the honest answer is nobody knows the answer to those questions because it's never happened and the Supreme Court didn't say. So there's lots of speculation that can be had. But the fact of the matter is, after the referendum is held and passed and negotiations begin, after that, we are in unknown territory. And we have to make things up as we go. But let's back up a little bit, because even getting to there is not a clear path. And there are some obstacles in the way that have become apparent inside Alberta. So right now, as you may be aware, there's a court process going on examining the proposed question that the APP has suggested for this referendum. And it got to court because the chief electoral officer in Alberta referred it to the court because the Citizen Initiative Act in Alberta gave him the power to do so. There's a section in that act that suggests that any referendum question, including a constitutional referendum question, cannot conflict with sections 1 to 35.1 of the Constitution Act 1982 of Canada. Now, Sections 1 to 34 is the Charter, and Section 35 is Aboriginal rights. So here's what the statute is saying. You are not allowed to have a constitutional referendum that proposes to breach the Charter or Aboriginal rights. You're not allowed to. You are not allowed to ask the people if they want out of the Charter or Aboriginal rights.
Mm.
Okay? That means that the statute is tying the hands of the people to decide what kind of independent country that they want.
Yeah.
And in this court process, and who knows how it's going to turn out, the decision won't come out probably until the new year. But it is possible that the court may say, well, in accordance with the statute, we are going to allow the question, but the question is conditional upon if there's a successful result, then the province has a mandate to negotiate independence, but not to negotiate their way out of the Charter or Section 35. In other words, that's out of bounds. Okay?
Yeah.
Let me emphasize this. This is a made in Alberta problem. This has nothing to do with Ottawa. It's not the Clarity Act, not the Supreme Court. It's not the Constitution. This is an Alberta statute that says, sorry, you can't ask that question.
Mm.
And so those Albertans who believe, as I do, that in order to do this successfully, to get an actually free and independent Alberta, you need to start again. You need to get rid of the Charter. You need to get rid of Aboriginal rights and other things. You need to get rid of the Canadian system. The Alberta statute is now standing in your way.
So I know the answer to this, and I agree with you completely, but I want to clarify for our listeners, because once again, we've been conditioned to believe that Aboriginal rights are just a necessity and that they have to exist. Right. For people listening and watching, my mother is Plains Cree Indian. My grandparents went through the residential school system. I completely agree with Bruce's view on this, just to preface it before you say what you're going to say, because again, these are, we generally have a very superficial knowledge of these issues and subjects, and when they come up in the way that you're discussing or the way that you've described it thus far, it does strike a chord within certain people. So Bruce, sure, can you clarify what you mean about absolving the Aboriginal rights in an independent Alberta or in Canada in general?
Yeah, good. Thank you for the question. So in my view, one of the features of this thing that we all love called the rule of law is the idea that the same laws and rules and rights should apply to everybody. Equal protection of the law. That is, justice is supposed to be blind. You go to a court, you know these statues of Lady Justice wearing a blindfold. That's because the law is supposed to be applied with an even hand, without fear or favor. It shouldn't matter who you are. And by that we mean, doesn't matter who your parents are, doesn't matter how wealthy you are, doesn't matter what culture you come from, doesn't matter what genes you carry. Everybody is treated by the law in the same way. The very existence of Aboriginal rights is in conflict with that idea. Mm. What we've done is say, we are going to make a difference depending upon who your parents are, depending upon what your genes are, depending upon what your lineage is, depending upon what the history is. We are going to give some people a different set of rights than other people. That, to my mind, is untenable.
Yes.
Right? And so if you are determined to start again, that is one of the respects in which you need to start again. Let's just be clear about this. What we're describing is a new country in which everybody, including those people that are now referred to as Aboriginal people, have the same rights as everybody else. So we are not talking about taking rights away from Aboriginal people because they have no rights. That is completely opposite to what we're saying. We're saying Aboriginal rights, Aboriginal peoples are people, just like other peoples are people. And the state should deal with people as individuals, not as groups. The results of the system that we have right now has been to the disadvantage, in my opinion, of most Aboriginal people, because these Aboriginal rights are group rights. And that means they are subject to the tyranny of the group, and in particular, the tyranny of Aboriginal elites and leaders. Okay?
Yes.
That means those leaders can abuse the members of the group. And the individuals in the group don't have any rights to have a say over what happens to the group resources, to the piles of money that's coming in, to the reserve lands that they live on. The Aboriginal people do not own the land. Those who live on reserves do not own the plot of land on which they live. That is held by the group, right? This is just another closer, smaller form of tyranny. Mm-hmm. And if Aboriginal people just want to be people like everybody else, then you have to get rid of this idea of a special status within a country. The other thing I would add is that the story that we've been telling ourselves for a long time, which is true, the original story is true. You had newcomers come in and basically take over the territory where the original people lived. That is all true. Okay. But that happened hundreds of years ago. And it's happened over and over and over and over again throughout human history. It's the standard thing that happens. And eventually we have to say, look, that happened in the past. Today, we are all mixed together. I mean, culturally, genetically, familially, lineage-wise. I mean, are we really saying that we are two distinct, pure blood groups of people? No. And the people who were there at the time that this conflict happened are all dead. Nobody alive today was there. And everybody who was born in this country is native to this country. There is no place for them to go, right? Yeah. So we are extending a mythology here in order to maintain a legal regime. And I think the time for both of them has passed.
Yes. Oh man, you said so many things there that I want to comment on. But I mean, look, when you give a certain group a set of rights, you're setting a precedent for other groups to contend for their own sets of rights.
Yes.
So that means Black women could end up with their own set of rights. And then trans Asian men could end up with their own set of rights. And you go down this path where what ends up happening is nobody has rights, and right. And with the Aboriginal side of it, the part that has always killed me is that through this system of Aboriginal rights and reservations and land treaties, we have created an isolated and alienated group of people.
Yes.
Right. And, I often say, like, privately, like, whenever I end up around a group of Indigenous people, there's a strange thing that happens inside of me where I feel a kinship to them, a responsibility to them. I feel at my most comfortable when I'm like driving around in the dirt on a reservation with a car full of natives,
Right.
And I don't know why that is, because I didn't grow up on a reservation. There's something ancestral inside of me that connects to them.
Sure.
Right. But when you talk about systemic racism, the real systemic racism that these people have experienced has come on behalf of a government that has made them believe they are eternal victims and entitled to certain rights that other people are not. Mm-hmm. And that to end that cycle, you actually have to remove those rights and introduce them into regular society. You have to, because as long as they exist in these dark, dusty corners that nobody visits and nobody can see, they will forever be alienated and isolated. And so, Bruce, that's why I completely agree with your perspective on this. It's just that, again, I feel like it's something that people don't think deeply about enough. And what they hear is just, more colonialism.
Yeah.
Right?
And I want to emphasize this. So there's nothing in this point of view that suggests that people's background is not important to them or shouldn't be important to them, that they can't associate with each other if they want to. And they can call themselves a group if they want to, that they can make their own groupings and they can follow their own traditions and they can value what they do. There's nothing about that we're talking about. We're only talking about one small thing, an important thing, but a small thing, a narrow thing, which is, how should the law distinguish between people?
Yes.
And the answer to that is, it should not. If we believe in blind justice, the law should not distinguish between people. Otherwise, everybody can do whatever they want.
Yeah. Yeah. Now, Bruce, before I run the risk of burning out that brain of yours, man, I want to get to this a draft for an Alberta constitution, because it's a beautiful document, man. You've put a lot of thought and a lot of energy into this, and you're one of those people, man. I don't want to blow too much smoke here, but like, if you ever ran for office, I'd vote for you in a heartbeat.
I would be a terrible politician. I'd be a terrible politician.
And you know what's crazy?
I wouldn't last 2 weeks.
Every great leader always says that because they don't want the job. They don't want to do it. But I think you would be perfect for it. And Bruce, I want to talk about this. And for people watching, if you want to read the document, it's right below this video, or if you're on an audio streamer, it's in the description. You can go read the thing in its entirety there. Read it last night, read it again this morning. It's a long read, but it's a beautiful one. So Bruce, can I want to break down this draft for an Alberta constitution?
Please, yeah, by all means. Yeah.
What were the ideas driving it, and what are the key points in it that you want people to absorb and be aware of?
Right. Let me revisit a couple of points that we've made just to remind people. So one of the ideas is the distinction between what and who. Mm-hmm. So if you just focus on the what, that is, you just list all the things that you think ought to exist, the rights that you should have and the outcomes that you like, then you are going to give power to the people who have the power, and they're going to change the answers. And that's going to surprise you, and you're not going to get to where you want to go. And so architecture is important. And by architecture, I mean you're setting up a system not just of content, but of describing who it is that has the power and how they get there and how long they have it. And what you're trying to do is you're trying to empower the state to do fundamentally important things like keep the peace. But you're trying to disempower it to do all the other things that it's doing right now, to make it impossible for them to stick their hands into all the nooks and crannies of life that they have their hands in right now. And that requires a combination of rules, but also processes to select those people who are going to have power. So let me just refer to a couple of things, perhaps. Number one is the flipping the default idea that we referred to earlier. And the other one is the idea of not having a powerful political class. And to do that, you need to have term limits. And term limits are not a new idea. People have talked about term limits for a long, long time. And they have term limits, for example, for the president in the United States.
Yep.
I'm talking about term limits for everybody who works for the state in any capacity. Anybody who works for the state in any capacity, if you are an elected representative, if you are a bureaucrat or another kind of employee, if you are a judge, if you're an ambassador, if you're a consultant, you can work for the state for a maximum of 6 years across your whole life, cumulatively. That is, if you're in office for 6 years, great, thank you for your service, you're done. You cannot be appointed as a judge. You cannot work as a consultant. You cannot become a bureaucrat. You're finished. If you become a judge and sit for 6 years on the bench, great. Now you're done. Now you cannot run for office. What we're trying to do is create an amateur group of public servants. That is, as a revolving door. People come in, they serve, they get out. Serve, get out. What you're doing is preventing the accumulation of people who have a vested personal interest in their status inside the state. Those are the people who have managed in the present day to expand the power of their own institutions in their own self-interest. You know, this is the military industrial complex, the biomedical state, the deep state, if you like, the protected bureaucratic class, the people with great salaries and beautiful pensions that you can't get rid of and you can't call to account. Okay. We do not want that group of people to exist. So this is just one of the measures that we could create in a constitution to prevent that from happening, to disperse power so that the people who are serving the state for that period of time are actually doing so for the right reason, which is to serve the state and to preserve the liberty of the people, because those people are going to be non-state actors very shortly themselves.
Yeah, man. Sorry, I'm just absorbing everything. Because reading it and then hearing you say it is, it to me, like, the problem that we have in Canada, and I think the problem in all Western nations, is that our bureaucratic institutions have far too much power, and they're far too attractive to corrupting forces. Right?
100%. 100%.
I mean,
yeah, yes, but it also relates to. Sorry, go ahead.
No, please, Bruce.
No, I was going to say you referred to something earlier on, in the sense that our difficulties also extend as deeply as into a kind of national character or an orientation, and this is part of the problem. So let me put it this way: a significant portion of the people who today work for the state, all those people we were talking about before, or work in some related area, you know, I'm including here, you know, school boards and universities and commissions and agencies and so on, in addition to the sort of the core institutions inside the state. Those people are largely university graduates. Not all, but a lot of them are. And what they have, one of the things they've learned at university is that their job is to know better than everybody else and to tell people what it is that they should do. And I'm not being facetious here. That is actually what they believe, because it's actually what
100%.
they're taught. It's actually what they are taught. And one of the main things that they've learned how to do in university is to think about and make policy. Now, what is policy? There's just a set of rules telling other people what to do. Our state apparatus is full of people who think that their job is to make rules telling other people what to do.
Yeah.
Okay. We have to get rid of that. And that's going to be a challenge, because there's a whole big population of relatively powerful people who adamantly believe that society cannot function without them doing this job.
Yeah.
Okay. And that's going to be one of the challenges.
Yeah. Well, you know, I mean, I was thinking when you were in your previous statement, like, you know, just look at Justin Trudeau is a really great example. I mean, he gave a number of wild interviews. I mean, like almost like diluted interviews, where he's talking about Canada is, you know, the Quebecois and the Laurentian elites are the rightful rulers of Canada. Right. Like, he actually said these things.
Yes,
and I'm like,
right.
I'm like looking back over time, and I'm thinking, how did anybody hear this and think that this was a good idea? But this is the attitude of these people. Like they believe that and it's because they go through these academic institutions, these elite institutions, where they learn that they are the, you know, the most significant people in our societies, that they have the right ideas, that this institution where they are inside of is where the right ideas are formed. Mm-hmm. And what I've always said about academics is most of them are the smartest dumb people I've ever known. You know, they've read every book in the library. You know, they can tell you I think part of the reason why we went through what we went through during COVID is because a lot of the policy was shaped by academics. Sure. And these are people who are who have a history of adhering to an authority that exists within a system. And if that authority sends down a dictate, then they follow it. Whereas people like yourself, although you're an academic, people like me, I'm a dummy, we tend to think outside of that structure because we're not used to being dictated to in that manner, right? We haven't been trained in that way, right?
Everybody follows their incentives.
Yeah.
Like, everybody follows their incentives. Well, maybe not everybody, but generally speaking, the trend is you follow your incentives.
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
Yeah. Sorry, please, Bruce, go ahead.
No, but everybody is inside a system of incentives, and academics are doing just that. I mean, they have gotten to where they are by following the doctrine that has earned them status. You know, they've done degrees and graduate work and a thesis, and they've been rewarded for, you know, doing something correctly, and they're in a structure, a hierarchical structure. Now, the irony is that no one has more professional freedom than an academic. They have tenure and academic freedom, but if you look at the inclinations, they tend to be a very conformist community. And that's because of the incentive structure.
Yeah, it's wild too, because these are the people who are in a lot of ways leading our societies. And Bruce, the framework that you've drafted for this new independent Alberta Constitution mitigates the power of those people, just in setting a 6-year term limit, right? But removing the pension. Something that grabbed my eye when I was reading it was each elected official receives an average salary, right? A salary equal to the average compensation of the individual.
You're trying to disincentivize people coming into the public service for the wrong reason. So if you pay them the average national wage for the period of time that they're working for the state, well, you don't do that to get rich, and there's no pension afterwards. So you're getting people who actually want to do public service for a little while and then go back to the actual productive thing they were doing in the private service. Now, some people might say this. They say, well, you're disincentivizing this so much that you're not going to get the best and the brightest, the most competent, the most learned people to do this job. And the response to that is, maybe so. Maybe so. The fact of the matter is, we want the best and the brightest, the most competent, the most imaginative, the most creative, the most diligent people to be working in the private sector.
Yes.
That's where they belong.
Yes.
Okay? We do want a relatively amateur public service. We do not want people to be vested in the status that they have inside the machine.
Well, also define best and brightest.
Exactly, right? Because exactly so.
Like, I know some guys right now who are doing road work that probably have some better ideas on how to run things than the people who are actually running things.
Sure.
And I think that's where we have, where we've fallen off, is that the people don't have a voice anymore.
Well, you see, you're also changing the criteria about what best and brightest and most successful is, right?
Yeah.
I mean, the idea we have in our heads that might have had some reality at some point along the way was that the market would define for you how well you're doing. You know, the customer is supposed to be always right.
Yeah.
But inside the government, inside the university, inside these institutions, there's a completely different set of criteria. They're not affected by the market in many respects. It's an internal calculus. And it's based upon a completely different set of things. And that calculus is kind of twisted and isolated from the real world and really has no place, doesn't need to exist.
Yeah, and I just think in general, like, we're just starting to move toward more real world people.
Yeah.
In terms of who we're electing. I mean, look at Trump. Look at his success in the United States. Now, look, he's a billionaire. He's not an average guy. But, you know, he sat in the room, I have to say, some pretty tense rooms with mob figures in the 80s trying to get construction contracts done. I mean, he's definitely a guy from the streets of New York. Yes, he was a rich kid. Yes, he's a Manhattan kid. It's not like he grew up somewhere in the South Bronx,
Right.
but he is more of a normal person. And I think that's where we're starting to walk toward. We're starting to get toward regular people. And under this constitution that you have drafted, that's what we would find. We would find more normal, everyday people in these roles. And look, for me, at least just through my life, my 42 years on this planet, experience accounts for a lot more than anything you'll read in a book, in my opinion. Right? Like just having the experience of being a middle class working person and finding yourself in say a position where you're I don't know, something within the government, your experience is going to lend more to better policy than somebody who just knows policy.
Now let's add to this feature the other proposition, which is that even those people who are serving during this limited period of time are not going to have very much to do. Right? Because part of what this Constitution does is disempower the state. So it starts with a rule, a basic rule. And the rule goes like this. All right, so the objective is to be free. What does that mean? If you are free, then you are not being coerced. And by coerced, we mean subject to the force of other people, including the state. In other words, nobody is telling you what to do by force. Not your neighbor, and not the police, and not the official from City Hall. If that is to be the case, then we are going to prohibit the use of force from your neighbor, from the police, from City Hall. Nobody can use force or threats of force against anybody else, including the state cannot use force. Now, there's an exception there because we're trying to keep the peace here. So if your neighbor attacks you, then that's the exception because you can call the police and have the police take care of it. Okay? But otherwise, there is no force. Now, laws depend on force. There is no law that's binding upon you that's not enforced. Let's say you drive down the street and there are cars parked everywhere. Right? And there's a sign that says no parking. But there's also a sign underneath the sign that says this parking restriction is not enforced. Okay. Well, there's no rule against parking now.
Yeah.
Right? Because without the enforcement, there is no rule. So if the state cannot use its force to enforce laws, then there are no laws. In other words, there is really only one law to which everybody is subject, which is you cannot use force against your neighbors. And of course, that is a whole big, complicated meaning. All kinds of things will constitute force. And a lot of the things that we're used to now will constitute force. But that's the singular proposition. But that's the proposition that frees us all from the meddling state telling us to do things like wear a bicycle helmet when you ride your bike or you get a ticket. Okay? Yeah. That's the use of force by the state. They're not preventing me from using force because I'm riding my own bicycle. The state will not have the power to do that. There's no policy. There's no enforcement. There's no police officers on bikes chasing me down the path. This is one of the things the state is just not able to do. And so all those people who are serving the state don't have that much to do.
Yeah. So, Bruce, final question before I again run the risk of burning you out. I could listen to you talk for hours, so I'm like, I got to wind it. We'll wrap it up before I drag you into a 4-hour philosophical conversation. So let's just say best case scenario, Alberta, we vote yes, we separate. It's a clean break from the Canadian Confederacy. We've managed to strip out the managerial state. I'm sure kicking and screaming they will go. Once we establish this new order and this new nation, how do we keep the corrupting influences from, entering into the picture?
Right. No, very good question. And it's always a danger. Part of this rotational thing will help because there won't be vested interests embedded in the state. And I've also tried to disempower the judges. Right. So first, judges are subject to this limitation as well. There's no career as a judge. You sit and then you get out and somebody else comes in. But in addition to that, you've got a court structure which is very simple, but includes an element that a lot of people might trip up over and think, oh, that's not good. I've suggested that we take out the doctrine of precedent. Now, the doctrine of precedent is supposed to guarantee consistency and predictability to ensure that different cases have the same rules applied to them. That's the theory, but it's not the reality. We have precedent right now. And inside our legal system right now, there are inconsistencies all over the place. And you can't depend upon a court coming to any particular decision. That's not actually the way it works. And so the function that precedent has right now is to give power to the Supreme Court of Canada. The Supreme Court of Canada can make judgments, and then all the courts below it have to follow it. And so the judges of the Supreme Court have power to determine social policy, and they've been doing so for years and years and years. So if you take away precedent, what that means is that each judge goes back to the words of the text themselves and is not dictated to by a small group of judges at the top of the judicial heap. And yes, we have to acknowledge that means that decisions are not going to be predictable and necessarily consistent. But they're not now. And the attempt to make them that way, I think, has probably turned into a fool's errand. I don't think you can do it. It's been tried. It would be ideal. But the nature of interpreting text and making decisions is such that there is inherent uncertainty in it. And so if you're going to disempower the people at the top, then you have to allow each particular court to interpret the words as best they can on their own, perhaps with guidance. They'll certainly read other things and see what has happened, but it won't be binding upon them. That way, everybody gets the same kind of shot at getting justice.
One last question. I'm sorry, you keep bringing up questions into my mind. One last final question. So, World Economic Forum's public-private partnership is just a different way of referring to fascism, right? Sure. And much of, Canada, the United States, much of the West has fallen into these quasi-fascist statuses, right?
Yeah.
So we get a free and independent Alberta, and now we have this, massively reduced bureaucracy. We've reduced the power of government. We've reduced the power of the judiciary. We've unlocked freedom of the individual, true, real freedom of the individual. How do we keep out, the corporate interests from corrupting that system from the top down?
Right. And this may be one of the more controversial bits of the piece that you read, and a difficult thing to achieve. But here's the idea. So one of the many rationales for having a big state is that we need the state because we have other big entities out there that are have us under the thumb. The big corporations especially. There's a lot of big corporations with a lot of power. So we need a state to counterbalance that power. Okay. Except that those corporations are a product of the state. Those corporations can't exist without the state.
Right.
They're created pursuant to a statute that the state passed. Okay. So these offsetting entities come from the same place. And they place the little guy at a competitive disadvantage because all these entities, corporations included, but not just corporations. You can include unions, you can include charities, you can include the central bank, you can include all the entities that have legal personality under the law. You say, look, the rank and file citizen cannot compete because all these entities have special powers. Corporations, for example, can give their investors limited liability. If someone invests in me, I can't give them that. So the little guy cannot compete. So if you're getting rid of all the state power to do things by force, one of the things you should probably do is prohibit them from creating entities with legal personality, meaning no corporations, no unions, no central banks, no charities. I mean, you can gather together as you wish and make contracts and associate and run businesses together, do whatever you want. But we're not going to create an entity that other people can't sue successfully because the statute has given them limited liability. So everybody is going to be an individual. Everybody is going to be an individual and be on an equal playing field that way. And then, you do whatever you want, compete the best you can, succeed, associate, partnership, and so on. But the corporate entity is one of the vehicles that, ironically, the state has created that keeps people oppressed.
Bruce Pardy, I really hope I'm talking to Alberta's Thomas Jefferson right now, man, because I think you're onto something. I think you're onto something. I really do. I read that document and I just, because it's hard, right? There's no perfect system.
No.
We've attempted it many times. The United States is a constitutional republic. You see the rot there. You see the rot in Canada, Australia, all the Commonwealth countries. Communism isn't the answer. There is no answer because, naturally everything over time rots as it ages. But right. I feel like you are onto a new concept that it incorporates ideas pulled from a number of different documents, but refined and really just updated for the modern world. And I hope President Bruce Pardy is somewhere in your future.
Don't count on that. Listen, I thank you very much. Phrase. Thank you for reading the document. I mean that's
of course.
That's the first thing I want to thank you for. But I really appreciate those comments. I am not going to be the president of anything, but I'm delighted to have found an audience in at least one person. With these ideas. So I thank you for that.
Well, I've been such a big fan of yours for a long time. I search Bruce Pardy on YouTube and Spotify every couple of weeks to see if there's something new with you out there, because again, I just think you're the guy with the vision. You're clear-eyed. The problem that I have, especially as it relates to Canada in a lot of ways, is that it's all coming. I think we are so steeped in ideology in this country that we don't even know it.
Yes,
we don't even know that we're talking from a perspective of a political cult.
The most powerful ideas are the ones you don't know you have.
Exactly right, and there's very few people, and I've tried to pull together the people that I feel are truly free individuals, and you're an intimidating figure for me because you're so on the nose. I can talk to Payman and be an idiot all day, every day, because he'll let it slide. But with somebody like you, I just feel like I can't. So
you're making a lot of sense to me. So well done.
Well, Bruce Pardy, I thank you so much for your time today, man. And I hope I can drag you back in here for another conversation sometime in the future. There's so much that I didn't even get to. I just, it was awesome. And I hope for everybody listening, you guys take Bruce's ideas into serious consideration. I know a lot of what Bruce has to say and a lot of what you're going to read in that document seems radical, but it's not. It's freedom. And the reason why it seems radical is just because you've never really truly been free. So
very, very, very well put. Very well put. Thank you.
Bruce, before we go, can you tell everybody where they can find you?
Yes, by all means. So we have my think tank, Rights Probe, has a website, rightsprobe.org. I have a Substack that people can sign up to for free. And on X, I'm at Pardy Bruce. Thanks for asking.
Guys, follow this man. The men with vision are few and far between nowadays. A lot of people claim to have it, but a lot of people don't. Bruce Pardy is your guy. Thank you once again, Bruce. I really appreciate your time today.
Thank you very much for the invitation. I really enjoyed it.